Before we dive into the strange, intoxicating world of Violet Charlesworth, I'll admit something up front. I get why people were obsessed with her. There's something magnetic about a woman who walked through high society like she owned the place, while everything around her was a carefully built illusion. And the deeper you go into her story, the harder it becomes to pull yourself out. The world Violet Charlesworth grew up in wasn't just elegant, it was deceptive, shimmering like polished glass right before it cracks. It was the early 1900s, that brief, glittering chapter wedged between the old Victorian stiffness and the storm of modern life. Cities buzzed with electric lights for the first time. Motor cars rattled down cobblestone streets. New fortunes were made overnight, and scandals traveled even faster. And in this strange transition era, part romance, part chaos, Violet learned something dangerous. People believe whatever sparkles. She wasn't born into luxury, but she walked into drawing rooms and country estates as if destiny had embroidered her name on every velvet curtain. A red cloak, a confident smile, stories told in just the right tone. And society, hungry for glamour, swallowed every lie whole. But nothing about Violet was simple. Not her beginnings, not her schemes, and definitely not the way she vanished, leaving behind debts, broken hearts, and a tale that still refuses to stay quiet. So let's dim the lights, because this is where the story shifts. From charm to deception, from romance to crime, from admiration to manhunt. This is the case of Violet Charlesworth, the woman who lived like a legend and disappeared like a ghost. In the early years of the 20th century, an age of silk gowns, motor cars, and whispered scandals, few names stirred as much intrigue as Violet Charlesworth. She appeared suddenly, dazzlingly, like a heroine torn from a penny novel. A young woman in a scarlet cloak, gliding through Edwardian Britain in gleaming automobiles, leaving admirers breathless and creditors hopeful. But Violet was not who she claimed to be, and the truth behind her life would become one of the strangest, most bewitching mysteries of the era. She was born May Charlesworth in Stafford in 1884, the youngest child of David Charlesworth, an insurance agent who later vanished to America, and Miriam Davies, a woman whose ambitions quietly exceeded her circumstances. May grew up on the move: Derby, Wolverhampton, Rhyl, places where the Charlesworths reinvented themselves just often enough that no one ever asked too many questions. By the time she entered her 20s, May had become Violet, a name that clung to her as naturally as her furs and diamonds. Miriam encouraged the transformation. Together, mother and daughter spun stories of wealth, inheritance, and a tragic soldier fiancé who had supposedly left Violet 70,000 British pounds. In Edwardian Britain, where titles and fortunes could open any door, Violet walked through them effortlessly. She drifted into drawing rooms and country clubs, her charm disarming, her confidence unshakable. She spoke of estates she would soon own, of riches she would inherit, of a future so bright that anyone who lent her money would surely be repaid many times over. People believed her, dozens of them. A doctor named Edward Hughes Jones even fell in love with her, convinced he would soon marry the wealthy young heiress. She wrote him letters laced with affection and desperation. "It cuts me to the heart to ask you for money. I who will have 7,000 British pounds a year and an estate, but it is all for love's sake, laddie." He gave her over 5,000 British pounds. Others gave their life savings. Together, Violet and Miriam accumulated debts nearing 27,000 British pounds, more than 4 million British pounds today. And still, Violet maintained the performance flawlessly. The clothes, the cars, the grand houses, Bod Erm Manor among them. She was seen gliding through North Wales in her signature red motor cloak, a living embodiment of luxury in a world hungry for spectacle. But all illusions must crack. On the 2nd of January 1909, the newspapers screamed with tragedy. Heiress killed in motor accident, body lost to the sea. According to the reports, Violet had been driving with her sister Lillian and her chauffeur along the cliffs near Penmaen Mawr. The car swerved, crashed into a wall, and Violet was thrown through the windscreen and into the raging waters below. No body was recovered. Britain mourned, but Britain also whispered. The story was too dramatic, too convenient, too theatrical even for the sensational Edwardian press. Rumors swelled like tides. Had Violet escaped her debts by staging her own death? Had the heiress, like a character from a Sherlock Holmes mystery, vanished into thin air? The police began to tug at loose threads. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Lillian's behavior grew stranger by the day. And then, months later, the breakthrough arrived. A woman calling herself Margaret MacLeod was spotted in a hotel in Oban, Scotland. Dark hair, fine features, the unmistakable air of someone accustomed to admiration. Reporters traveled north, police shadowed her. And miraculously, almost fatefully, Lillian Charlesworth appeared in the same hotel, insisting Margaret was a stranger. Yet the two women left together, shared a hotel room in Glasgow, dodged reporters by slipping into a goods lift. Finally, a persistent journalist cornered Margaret in Edinburgh, cornered her, and broke the spell. Her voice trembled, her shoulders dropped. "Yes," she whispered, "I am Violet Charlesworth." The confession exploded across British newspapers. Crowds devoured every detail: her escape from the cliff, her lonely walk to Conwy Station, the train to Glasgow, the aliases, the disguises. Even her handwriting, matched by experts, sealed the truth. And then came the second revelation, the full magnitude of her fraud: the jewels, the estates, the motor cars, the stock exchange speculation. Her gem collection, declared by an astonished merchant to include some of the finest diamonds in Britain, remained the greatest mystery of all. Where she obtained them, no one knew. Where they vanished, no one ever discovered. By 1910, Violet and Miriam stood trial at the Derbyshire Assizes. Both pleaded not guilty. Both were found guilty. 5 years penal servitude, later reduced to 3. They served their sentence in Aylesbury Prison. And then, in February 1912, Violet walked out of the prison gates and into oblivion. So why did Violet Charlesworth slip under history's radar? For a woman who once dominated headlines, her vanishing act was almost too perfect. Her accomplishments, if we can dare call them that, were staggering. She didn't just con society, she seduced it. She moved from the cramped back streets of Derby to the drawing rooms of high society with nothing but confidence, charm, and a talent for illusion. So remarkable, in fact, that early 20th century Britain coined a phrase for her brand of deception. But despite the theatrical car crash, the national manhunt, and the courtroom drama, Violet slowly slipped from public memory. And there are reasons for that, reasons as fascinating as Violet herself. First, her final fraud was executed with such breathtaking precision that proving it, or disproving it, became almost impossible. She staged her own death with the dramatic flair of a silent film heroine, stepped into a new identity, and sailed off into the world with her diamonds, leaving behind creditors and broken hearts who never received closure. Even now, more than a century later, historians can only make educated guesses. 5 of them, in fact. Second, Earlier investigations never managed to see past the smokescreen she and Miriam created. A veil of secrets, contradictions, charm, and distraction. Violet didn't just trick individuals, she tricked an entire society. And until someone was willing to dig deep enough, the truth remained buried beneath layers of misdirection. And then, of course, there was the world itself. Britain on the eve of the First World War was a place already rattled by the suffragette movement, political scandal, and cultural upheaval. The last thing the male establishment wanted was another infamous woman dominating front pages, especially one who had outsmarted wealthy men, bankers, doctors, and perhaps even lovers. And so, sweeping Violet under the rug became convenient. Several prominent and likely married men preferred that their involvement with the mysterious heiress never resurfaced. Newspapers obligingly shifted their attention elsewhere. But the final blow to Violet's legend came not from courts or creditors, but from fate. Just as her story was about to explode again, just as journalists were rediscovering her trail, two events struck Britain with crushing force: the sinking of the Titanic and the outbreak of war in Europe. Overnight, every other headline, every scandal, every mystery was erased. And when the world finally emerged from that trauma, time had reshaped everything. Violet's story was no longer urgent, no longer sensational, no longer remembered. What survived instead was her echo, an inspiration for future generations of daring, stylish female swindlers. And even then, she remained more myth than woman, more shadow than memory. Because here's the truth: Violet was no victim of society. She was a master of it. Where others saw barriers, she saw opportunities. Where others obeyed rules, she rewrote them. She broke hearts with softness and took fortunes with a smile. Her crimes were delivered with elegance, wit, and an almost theatrical flourish. And though her victims suffered, many admitted, even years later, that there was something strangely admirable in the way she moved through the world. The grace, the charm, the daring, the audacity. She manipulated society with style, lived with flamboyance, and vanished with legendary precision. And maybe, just maybe, that is why her story still pulls us in. Because Violet Charlesworth wasn't simply a fraudster. She was a mirror held up to her era, reflecting every desire, every weakness, every fantasy Edwardian Britain wanted to believe. And like all great illusions, she disappeared before anyone could truly understand how she did it. History lost her trail entirely. A death certificate for a May Charlesworth surfaced decades later. It might have been her, or just another shadow. What do you think about this intriguing woman? Drop your thoughts in the comments.